the book of Daniel, a series of talks about the book of Daniel. One chapter at a time. So again, let's get cracking. I would like to speak about Daniel 8, the vision of the ram and the goat, where the daily offering is stopped. Daniel was either in Babylon when he had this vision and saw himself in Susan and on the bank of the river Ulai, or he was in Susan himself, which is 300 kilometers east of Babylon and about 230 kilometers north of the tip of the Persian Gulf. Ulai was close to Susan and the later capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. That was Susan, and we see that in the book of Esther. We can easily divide this vision in two parts. There's an introduction up to Alexander the Great, and what happened after him is actually more important in God's eyes. And that's the second part. The interpretation of the vision again is more elaborate than the vision itself. That happens more often. That is not strange. God wants to tell us more, especially about the second part. So let's start reading. And we read first of all verse 1 to 8 and 15 to 22. So the first part of the vision with the interpretation of the first part of the vision. Let's read. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking, that I was in Susan the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and I saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram, which had two horns, and the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the high one came up the last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver it from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. And I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, four notable ones came up toward the four winds of the heaven. Okay, so we go to verse 15. Then it happened, when Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came I was afraid and fell on my face, but he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me upright. And he said, look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be. The ram which you saw, having 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of the nation, but not with its power. So that's the first part of the vision and its explanation, its interpretation. This is prophetical history, or you could say his story, the way God looks at history. No invasion from Europe had happened yet when Daniel received this vision, and the Greeks only were city-states fighting each other when Daniel wrote this down. So this is special. He looks forward, far, very far. Babylon isn't mentioned at all. We're at the end of this kingdom of Babylon, but still in the reign of Belshazzar, the 3rd year. But it's not any more important. The banner of the Persians, by the way, had a ram, and of the Greeks it was a goat. The Persians had a great and mighty empire and a large army. They spread to the north, to the west and to the south, and not to the east. Alexander the Great defeated the Persians 3 times with a smaller army, and he really works in a fast way and by surprise. So he reaches far in about 3 years, far to the east. He came from the west and he went to the east. But he dies of an illness in Babylon, and his empire is divided in 4 parts. In Macedonia, where he came from, in Asia, you could say Turkey, in Syria and Egypt, about. Only the last 2 are important for Israel, and that's what we'll see in the next part. So let's turn to the second part of the vision, because this first part, well, that's only the introduction. God shows that he knows what is going to happen and how these 2 kingdoms, the north and the south kingdom, related to Israel, Syria and Egypt, came into being, stemming from this Alexander the Great empire, the Greek empire. So when we see in chapter 7 that the Greek empire is the 3rd empire, and we don't see a division there very much. It's handled as one empire. Here we see more detailed history about the northern and the southern kingdom, Syria and Egypt. And that's important. We'll take a look. So we'll read from verse 9 to verse 14, the second part of the vision, and the interpretation, from verse 23 to 27. So let's take a look. And out of one of these horns, came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land, which is, of course, Israel. And it grew up to the host of heaven. So it was a rebel against heaven. And it cast down some of the host and some of the stars in the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did this all and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, "How long will the vision be? Concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. And he said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. And then we see the explanation, the interpretation. First, the first part, we already read that, and we continue in verse 23. And in the latter time of their kingdom, the kingdom of the Greeks, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken without human means. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterwards I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. So Daniel was perplexed by what he had seen, what was explained to him, but he had to seal it up. It was for the future. But this vision has a double meaning. Let's take a look. We read about the little horn again. In chapter 7 we read about the little horn, but this one is different. Though he seems to be some kind of type. We know this little horn refers to Antiochus Epihanes, which we'll see again in chapter 11. And that's the chapter that relates this story of Syria and Egypt in much more detail. He's the 8th king of the Seleucids. His nickname was Epihanes, which means he was a madman, for his wild and wicked behavior. If he turns again to the glorious land, Israel, his general takes Jerusalem on a Sabbath, erects an idol of Zeus, and desecrates the altar by offering pigs. Horrible for the Jews. So he really trampled down things. The daily offering ceases, as we see, as is spoken in Daniel, in Daniel 8, verse 13. Verse 11. He exalts himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. So the daily sacrifice was taken away. It ceases. So God didn't receive the honor due to him. Well, let's think about that. The daily sacrifice in the temple was for the glory of the Lord. What about us? How do we give glory and honor that is due to him daily? The daily sacrifice was brought in the morning and in the evening, twice a day. And there was also this offering of spices, a very special odor in the temple. So he was given praise daily. And then it stopped for 2,300 days. Of course, God knows about it. It is He Himself who hands over the army, Israel, because of the apostasy of the Jews. So there was a reason why He allowed it to happen. But Antiochus attacks God Himself with what he does. And ever so often an instrument in God's hand isn't innocent himself. We see that in Babylon. We'll see that in the prophets many a time. So Babylon being the instrument in God's hand to punish Israel and to bring it into captivity is itself also judged. You see that in Isaiah, we see that in Habakkuk and everywhere. But this man also destroys the Torah rolls. He casts the truth down. That's what we read. And if God allows something, it doesn't mean He approves what is being done. Of course not. But He allows it to happen to teach a lesson. And probably in verse 13 we probably read about two angels talking to each other. How long will this last? How long does God let all this happen? The answer to Daniel is given. The time is limited. And that's also a very important lesson. The time that God allowed difficult things, problematic things to happen is always limited. That's also the message in Revelation. The time is limited. There is given a certain time to the devil, to the beast, to do things. And here it's the same. A certain time. The time is limited. What exactly this time was, we don't know. Some say it's indeed 2,300 days. Others say no, it's 2,300 offerings. Twice a day means 1,150 days. Well, we'll not discuss this point now. But it leads to the revolt of the Maccabees. More about this, by the way, we also find in chapter 11. There we find the Maccabees spelled out, so to speak. The temple will be cleansed and reconsecrated. And that's what we see in chapter 8, verse 14. Then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Yes, God is doing that. He will reconsecrate the temple. And He has done this. And this is still a feast. Was a feast in the time of Jesus. And the Hanukkah feast. And it's an important feast. It's a remembrance of this fact. A persecutor of the Jews in Russia asked a Jew what he thought the outcome would be if the wave of persecution would keep on going. The Jew answered, the result will be a feast. Pharaoh tried to destroy the Jews, but the result was the Passover feast. Haman attempted to destroy the Jews, and the result was the feast of Purim. Antiochus Epihanes tried to destroy the Jews, but the result was the feast of dedication. So that's a special way of looking at it. God is always planning to do special things. Then the interpretation continues. In verse 17 we read, understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. So there's a first fulfillment in the time of the Maccabees, but eventually it's all about the end time. And verse 20 to 22 interprets the first part in a few lines But then we read in verse 23, a few lines regarding to Alexander the Great, etc., in the latter time of their kingdom, the kingdom of the Greeks. What follows is also about Antiochus Epiphanes, but mainly as a picture. If we take a look at the history of Antiochus Epiphanes, it's like a picture of the later little horn, which we find in chapter 7. This king, Antiochus Epiphanes, he died by a disease. But in the end time, the Lord will judge the little horn, the beast, and throw it into the pool of fire. That's what we see in Revelation 19, the judgment of the beast and his prophet. They are thrown into the pool of fire. Because it's a rebellion against the Prince of Princes, and that's the Lord Jesus, the Prince of Princes announced here already. The explanation in verse 25 is more specific than the vision itself, as is often the case. We have a vision, an interpretation that says more than the vision itself. So what do we learn from all this? First of all, God is the God of history. It is His story. That's one. This chapter, by the way, has largely been fulfilled. Secondly, we see that prophecy has a double fulfillment very often. The first one being Antiochus Epiphanes, and of course also Alexander the Great, but Antiochus Epiphanes is a picture of something that will happen later. And that's what we also see in the next chapters. In chapter 11 it's very important, again this same figure, Antiochus Epiphanes, is a picture of what is going to happen in the end time. And if it says end time, it means end time, of course. That's why it's be sealed up. It's shown later. In Revelation, we don't see a sealing up. There's only one real fulfillment. The third lesson is God controls everything. Even if He allows things to happen, and it can be in the greater history, the wars between different nations, things raging in this world like a pandemic, but also in our specific lives, personal lives. Sometimes a tragedy happens in my life or in yours. But God is still in control. If He permits things to happen, remember, there's always a goal, that we do not always know or see it. Sometimes we see something happening because of the tragedy happening in our personal lives. We see things happening afterwards, and we thank God because He turns things into glorious things for our well-being or for the well-being of others. But sometimes we don't see that. But we will in the end, eventually. He will show us why. He doesn't explain, as He also didn't explain to Job why he had to suffer like this. We know more than Job did. But He will explain later on to us as well. The personal things happening. And then there's this important question. Do we always give Him the honor due to Him? Also in times like a pandemic happening now, Corona time. Do we give Him the honor due to him daily, like the daily sacrifices? Do we thank him daily? Offer him daily our thanks? And maybe not only thanks in praise with our lips, but also in what we do, what we give, how we live our lives, how we lead our lives. So let's thank him, because he leads us personally, and there's also a goal in history, and he proceeds fulfilling his goals. And there will also always be a fulfillment of what he started. And if he spoke to Daniel about what has happened largely, there's also, as we saw a double fulfillment, and he will also fulfill that. Glory to him.